Welcome. This is Christina DiStefano, and you're listening to the Invisible Architecture Podcast. There's a common belief in real estate that negotiation is about leverage, about who pushes harder, who holds firm, who gets the biggest discount. And if you've ever watched real estate shows, the ones where negotiation wraps up in 30 seconds, you'd think this is how deals actually get done. Someone throws out a number, someone counters, and suddenly there's a handshake. But if you've spent any time inside real luxury negotiations, you know that version of reality is mostly fiction. In practice, negotiation at this level is rarely fast, rarely linear, and almost never about a single move. It's a process, a rhythm. It's a series of signals being exchanged in real time. Most people assume negotiation is about winning in the moment. But in luxury real estate, it's about protecting what comes after the moment. And that distinction matters more now than it has in years, because this isn't a loose market anymore. In Manhattan and across New York City, we're operating in an environment where inventory remains constrained relative to demand, even as pricing holds firm and luxury deals continue to close at pace. Throughout 2025, multiple markets reported showing listings down year over year in key neighborhoods, while buyer activity, especially on the high end, remained strong. We also saw a surge in high-end transactions along historically high levels of all-cash purchases, which further intensified competition. What that means in practical terms is this: buyers are competing not just on price, but on credibility. And in competitive markets, the way you negotiate doesn't simply affect outcome. It determines whether you stay in the room at all. That's where today's conversation begins. Because most luxury negotiations don't fall apart due to confrontation. They fall apart because momentum is lost, often quietly, often unintentionally. When most buyers think about negotiation, they think about price. They think about how much room there is, where to start, how aggressively to come in. And that makes sense. Negotiation advice, especially outside of the industry, has been framed for years as a kind of performance. You anchor low, you push back, you test limits. And if you've lived through softer market cycles, especially during the pandemic era, those tactics may have worked. We all remember a time when inventory was abundant, concessions were common, and developers were far more flexible. Discounts of 10, 15, even 20% became part of the conversation. That period reshaped expectations. But markets evolve, and the mistake many buyers make today is negotiating from memory, not from current conditions. The market we're in now, particularly in Manhattan, is tighter. Inventory is lighter. Demand at the high end is resilient, and sellers are far more selective as to how they engage. Yet many buyers still approach negotiations as if the rules haven't changed, and that's where the friction begins. There's a belief that starting aggressively creates leverage, that a very low opening offer signals confidence, strength, and seriousness. But from the developer side, what those offers often signal instead is misalignment. Once misalignment is felt, negotiations don't escalate, they contract. At this level of the market, sellers aren't just evaluating numbers, they're evaluating who they're dealing with. There's another layer buyers don't always realize is happening. When an opening offer comes in far outside of the realm of market reality, it doesn't just affect the negotiation. It raises a deeper question. Is this someone who is actually going to get to the finish line? From the developer's perspective, negotiation is also a probability assessment. Confidence in execution matters. If a buyer appears unfamiliar with how luxury transactions, especially new development, actually work, confidence erodes quickly, not emotionally, practically. It can signal inexperience in this segment of the market, a lack of fluency in how sponsors transact, or a process that may become unnecessarily difficult. Now, to be fair, this isn't always the broker's doing. Often, buyer's agents are executing exactly what their clients are asking them to do. They're presenting the offer that their buyer once presented. But at this level of the market, an advisor's role isn't just delivery, it's translation. An experienced advisor educates their client on where the market actually is, how a specific developer tends to transact, what that sponsor values beyond price, and how certain moves are likely to be received. There's one more reality buyers rarely see. Developers are managing a lot at once. So when an opening offer comes in that's wildly disconnected from reality, it often causes the buyer to quietly fall off the radar. In luxury real estate, losing attention is often more damaging than receiving a firm no. Once attention shifts elsewhere, it's very difficult to get it back. When buyers think about negotiation, they tend to focus on what's visible, the number, the counter, the final price. But from the developer side, negotiation is not just a conversation about value. It's an evaluation of viability. Developers are asking a much broader set of questions, often simultaneously, often subconsciously. Is this buyer actually ready? Is this deal likely to close? How much friction will this introduce? And how much internal attention will this require? Because a luxury transaction doesn't exist in isolation. It touches legal teams, finance teams, sales leadership, construction timelines, investor expectations. Every deal carries operational cost long before it ever closes. So when an offer comes in, developers aren't just deciding whether they like a number, they're deciding whether they want to carry the deal. Confidence is an execution, not just intent. Because one of the first things being evaluated is confidence, specifically confidence in execution, not enthusiasm, not aspiration, not execution, but rather, does this buyer appear financially prepared? Do they understand the process they're entering? Do they seem ready to move decisively? One of the red flags I've seen, particularly with direct buyers or inexperienced buyer's agents, is when financing isn't clearly understood at the onset. When a buyer hasn't actually spoken to a lender, they don't know what they're approved for, or they haven't clarified what portion of the purchase will be financed. That uncertainty may not surface immediately, but it shows up later. In delayed contract signings, in repeated follow-ups, in hesitation at the exact moment momentum matters most. And from the developer side, that delay sends a clear signal. This buyer may not actually be ready. There's a saying in real estate for a reason: time kills all deals. The longer a contract sits out, the more confidence erodes, not emotionally, but practically. Because readiness isn't something you declare, it's something you demonstrate. Your seriousness is a signal of clarity. Another thing developers are quietly evaluating is your seriousness, not in a performative sense, but in pattern recognition. When buyers submit unrealistic offers or appear to be hedging by placing multiple offers across different properties all at once, starts to look like an exploration rather than a commitment. And again, this isn't judged harshly, but it's noted. From a developer's perspective, it can signal that the buyer is testing rather than deciding, seeing what actually sticks rather than committing, or still uncertain about what they actually want. That uncertainty makes the deal feel fragile, and fragile deals are rarely prioritized. There's another inflection point that matters deeply, though buyers rarely realize it. When a contract is issued, at that stage, developers expect momentum to continue forward. So when buyers attempt to renegotiate after the contract is out, especially on core terms, it raises serious concerns. Not because negotiation itself is unwelcome, but because it suggests unfamiliarity with how new development transactions are structured. At this level, renegotiating after contract issuance isn't seen as strategic. It's seen as a signal that the process may become unstable. And once instability enters the picture, confidence drops sharply. It's important to say this clearly. Developers are not opposed to complex deals. They will entertain creative structures, thoughtful timing considerations, and nuanced terms when they're framed with clarity and confidence. The issue isn't complexity, it's confusion. When a deal feels overly complicated without a clear anchor, particularly around purchase price and execution, confidence erodes. Too many variables, too much uncertainty, too many moving pieces without a coherent through line. That's when a deal begins to feel risky rather than sophisticated. And again, developers don't reject those deals loudly. They simply stop leaning into them. This is where internal advocacy becomes decisive. Every deal needs someone on the developer side who is willing to say, this buyer is real, this will close, this is worth carrying. That advocacy doesn't come from the numbers alone, it comes from trust. Often that trust exists because the buyer's advisor has a relationship with the developer or a reputation that precedes them. When a developer trusts the advisor, they trust the signal. They're more willing to believe that the buyer is viable, the process will be managed, and the deal will reach the finish line. This is one of the invisible things advisors offer beyond strategy or negotiation. They offer their reputation, their credibility, and their standing with the developer. And that trust often creates flexibility where none would otherwise exist. From the buyer's seat, none of this is visible. They see numbers moving or not moving. They see silence or delays. They don't see the moment when confidence quietly shifts, or when attention moved elsewhere, or when a deal was intentionally deprioritized without formal rejection. That's why buyers often feel confused when negotiations stall, not because anyone was dishonest, but because something essential was evaluated and found lacking invisibly. This brings us to the most fragile moment in a luxury negotiation, the precise point where momentum is either preserved or quietly lost. Most luxury deals don't fall apart with drama. There's no explosive phone call, no slammed door, no final rejection. They stall quietly. And by the time buyers realize something has shifted, the moment has already passed. What's important to understand is that traction isn't lost all at once. It's lost in small, cumulative moments, often invisible to the buyer. The first inflection point is the opening signal. That first moment, traction is either established or compromised. That's the opening move. Not because the number alone, but because what the number signals. An opening offer does more than propose price. It sets tone. It communicates fluency. It establishes whether the buyer understands the market they're stepping into. When that opening signal is grounded, even if it's firm, it invites engagement. When it's disconnected from reality, it introduces doubt. And when doubt enters the room, everything slows. Developers don't rush to shut the door, they simply stop leaning forward. The second inflection point is time. This is the moment traction begins to erode. Time between responses, time between decisions, time between contract issuance and execution. In luxury real estate, time is not neutral, it's interpreted. A delayed response can read as hesitation. A stalled contract can read as unreadiness. Silence can read as uncertainty. And while buyers often assume time creates leverage, the opposite is usually true. The longer momentum stretches, the more confidence thins. And as confidence thins, flexibility disappears. This is why the phrase, time kills all deals, exists. It's not a warning, but an observation. The third inflection point, tone shifts. This is another moment traction is quietly lost when the tone shifts, not dramatically, but subtly. When conversations become more rigid, when positions harden prematurely, when communication feels transactional instead of intentional, tone tells a story. And once the story shifts from collaboration to contention, internal enthusiasm fades. Developers don't respond by escalating. They respond by disengaging. The fourth inflection point, missed opportunities on terms. So one of the most misunderstood moments in negotiation is when price becomes the sole focus. Price is visible. Terms are contextual. But often it's the terms and not the price that hold the most room for alignment. When buyers focus exclusively on the number, they often miss opportunities to create real value elsewhere. And from the developer side, this signals a narrow frame. Not wrong, just limited. That limitation makes negotiation feel heavier, and heavier negotiations don't travel far. The final inflection point, emotional escalation. This is the last and most damaging. It's that moment traction is lost due to emotional escalation. When frustration enters the process, when urgency becomes pressure, when negotiation turns personal. Once emotion overtakes clarity, the deal changes shape. Developers aren't evaluating passion at that stage. They're evaluating risk. And emotional volatility reads as unpredictability. At that point, even strong offers struggle to recover momentum. Once you understand how and why traction is lost, negotiation starts to look differently. It's no longer about force, it's about discernment. The most effective luxury negotiations aren't aggressive or passive, they're intentional. Luxury negotiation is about stewardship. The most powerful negotiations don't feel aggressive, they feel inevitable. Luxury negotiations don't need to be louder, they need to be more precise. Because in the end, the strongest position in any negotiation isn't force, it's clarity. And that is the invisible architecture.